Hi, I'm Michael Senoff, founder and CEO of HardToFindSeminars.com. For the last 5 years, I've interviewed the world's best business and marketing minds. Along the way, I've created a successful publishing business, all from home from my two-car garage. When my first child was born, he was very sick, and it was then that I knew I had to have a business that I could operate from home. Now my challenge is to build the world's largest free resource for online downloadable MP3 audio business interviews. I knew I needed a site that contained strategies, solutions, and inside angles to help you live better, to save and make more money, to stay healthier, and to get more out of life. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years, and today I'm going to show you the skills you need to survive. Hi, it's Michael Senoff with Michael Senoff's HardToFindSeminars.com. The title of this interview is called How to Double or Even Triple Your Marketplace and Get Your Direct Mailing Right. It's an interview with legendary list broker Michael Fishman. If you think companies simply luck into their successful direct mail campaigns, then this audio will amaze you. In it, you'll hear from one of the world's best list brokers. His name is Michael Fishman, and you'll learn about how to expand your list universe and take the guesswork out of your direct mail promotions. And Michael knows what he's talking about. He's worked with some of the biggest names in the business, including legendary copywriter Gary Bencivenga, who calls Michael the list wizard because of the way he works like magic behind the scenes in some of the largest campaigns ever. And in this interview, you'll hear from the wizard himself about how he does his magic by expanding marketplaces and finding similarities where other list brokers don't. But according to Michael, before you even think about expanding your list universe, you need to fully understand what your market is and how your product fits into it. And in this audio, you'll hear how to do that. You'll also learn how to think outside your immediate category and find customers in places you never thought to look. You'll learn all about the different elements of a direct mail campaign and how they work together to create success. You'll learn how to run the kind of test that validates demand for your product while giving you the kind of concrete results you can trust. You'll learn 3 things Michael looks for in a list to know for sure if it will work. You'll learn all about word branding and ways to build trust even if nobody knows your name right now. You'll learn about crossing over from internet success to direct mail success and vice versa. You'll also learn all about the 3 types of direct mail, what works, what doesn't, and what you'll definitely want to avoid. Finding target customers may be more strategic than you think. It usually involves tracking them down and getting them to migrate to your product. In this interview, we'll tell you how to do that, including all the other things you need to know to take the guesswork out of your direct mail. Now let's get going. Well, I remember when we talked last, you had mentioned that you knew Eugene Schwartz, and I've listened to Eugene Schwartz speak, and one thing that really impacted me when he spoke, he talked about how you can't really create demand with copywriting or with marketing. You have to channel demand, and it kind of reminded me of what you have here. What should a marketer do before you try and sell anything?
Well, it's a great question, Michael. I appreciate that, and I'm glad that we kind of have Gene's spirit with us on the call, too. Well, before selling anything, there's a couple things, and the way I see it, number one, to really understand your market. You know, what Gene said is very true. You can't create demand, and I think as he put it, it's too big and too enormous for anybody or any company or organization to create. You can either channel it if it exists, or you can trigger it if there's latent demand for something, but it's always there to be channeled, not created. The thing you need to do is understand your market, understand not so much from a product perspective, but from a needs perspective, either needs or experiences or knowledge. What does the market want, or what does the market segment that you're thinking of addressing or doing business with want? What are their deeply held aspirations and desires? What are they trying to achieve? Where are they trying to get to? So understanding your market at that level helps you get to a product that has a chance to make it in what is certainly a very tough and competitive marketplace. The other thing is to validate the demand for the product. There are products that we call product-driven, which is an editor or a product designer or a product developer falls in love with a product and feels certain that the market wants it, and then marketing goes out and tries to sell that product with disappointing results, if not outright failure. The best way to approach it from a research perspective, and the research can be very simple questions to email list. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. But to validate demand, you talk about your product with your market in a survey format, either online or offline. You let them know what it will be. You maybe talk about some of the options for what you might want to name the product, and even might go so far as some of the early marketing headlines or some of the descriptive language for selling the product, and see how your list or how the marketplace responds to that. So validating demand is important. Understanding your market is important. Put yourself in the shoes of your prospects and customers. You know, someone said it as think as your market, not think of your market. To find little nuance there, but I think it's very, very helpful.
Can you give me an example of maybe a campaign or someone who you knew had fallen in love with their product, and maybe a story of how that created a pretty big failure?
I think in the health market, where I've spent a tremendous amount of time in the last 25 years, most of my business practices in health and self-help topics, information and products. We'll get into plenty of specifics as we talk here, but without getting into specifics in this case, there are, as an example, newsletters that have been positioned with particular doctors that companies have struggled to market year after year, ultimately to either alter their expectations and realize that they've got a much smaller business than they originally had hoped for, or just to discontinue their efforts to build that brand or to build that business positioned with that doctor. I think any concept in any business can be tested, even with some very simple research, some very simple questionnaires, with customers, with prospects. I know Tim Ferriss, who wrote The 4-Hour Workweek, talks in his book about how he named the 4-Hour Workweek by doing some testing with Google AdWords. Or people in the offline world can do questionnaires to their customers and even to some outside prospects. So those things are possible, but that can be done for virtually any product in any marketplace. I'm sure there are thousands of examples of products that have failed, which, had there been some even simple research activities, would never have been launched.
Can you give a realistic idea if someone launches with a product and let's say they approach you on a large level because you're dealing with large numbers and pretty established products and companies, how many home runs are there? I mean, what are the numbers? Out of 100 campaigns, what do you see statistically can end up being a real home run and a big winner for a company?
It's a good question, Michael, and the definition of a home run, just like the definition of a simple word like success, is different for every organization. One company can get a 2% response in direct mail, let's say, and throw a party to celebrate such a great result, and that same 2% at another company could be a pretty bad problem. So it really depends on product and price points and marketplaces and the economics of the organization that's doing the marketing. But I guess from a mailing list perspective, where a home run is a company that's mailing in, say, the tens of millions of names each year, those are a small percentage of the marketplace. That's maybe 5 or 10% of the organizations that are, well, in the bigger scheme, it's probably less than 5% of the companies that touch the direct mail medium are mailing tens of millions of names a year and enjoying that level of sales, that size of database, and everything that goes along with that.
Well, what would under that level be? I mean, still some success, maybe a couple million pieces a year. Can there still be some success at that level?
Absolutely. And once again, the danger of characterizing a home run, I think, is that anybody who finds that they're not inside the criteria feels insufficient or says, gee, I'm not as successful as I thought. And so I really encourage everybody listening, don't go there. There are lots of companies, again, depending on price point, depending on the size of the marketplace, depending on how well they create a relationship with the new customer and continue to do business with them beyond the first transaction, which of course is critical in all of direct marketing. Companies that mail in, just a few million names a year or even in the hundreds of thousands, some of them are very, very successful and very, very profitable.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about brand assessments, but first I want to ask you, you have a lot of background over the years in list management, you're a list broker, and I wanted to ask you, what would you weigh the importance of a direct mail campaign in relationship to the copywriter and the list and the offer? I know there's some great educators who say that the list is 40%, the offer is 40%, and the copy is 20%. What would your estimation be on something like that?
The only thing I can say is that I wouldn't really subscribe to any number assignment. For those 3 pieces. I would not want to be without any of them. It's just that simple. I have a high regard for wonderful, thoughtful, imaginative, and powerful direct response copy. I do a fair amount of coaching of the major copywriters, and I do a fair amount of polishing of their work, rewriting headlines and landing pages and direct mail pieces and so forth. So I know the world they live in, and there's only a relative handful, easily under 100 and probably under 50 fantastic direct response copywriters in the entire country. There's more great professional shortstops than there are great copywriters, so it's sort of amazing when you think of it on those terms. But copy and the language that presents these products to the marketplace and the way in which copy taps into human behavior and human aspiration and getting people engaged with companies and with products is indispensable. A list that is well understood, that is well maintained, technologically, that's clean and deliverable and so forth, and represents a strong transaction that each of the people on that list have in common. That's a critical piece of the puzzle. So I wouldn't assign a number, but these things are interdependent, and you just would not want to be without any one of them.
About a year and a half ago, I interviewed Mike Pavlish. Have you heard of Mike Pavlish?
I've heard his name.
I asked him, I'd love to get some information about some list brokers, and he laughed. He goes, they're a sneaky bunch. Not sneaky in the way of anything negative, but it's hard to get information from list brokers. So I would ask, if there's 50 great world-class copywriters out there, how would that look for great list brokers who really know their game out there? Are there a large amount, or is it as finite as great copywriters?
I think it's actually a similar number. There are very few list brokerage firms in the marketplace. The one that I work for is certainly one of the preeminent ones. But if you look at list brokers in terms of individual practitioners, it's a similar number to copywriters, well under 100 and probably less than 50, that really are passionate, that have availed themselves of every resource, book, connection, learning opportunity, and have gone so far as to put their own signature and their own stamp on the marketing process. There's very precious few of those.
How hard is it for a relatively unknown company to generate leads and generate sales in the direct marketing world? And how would you compare it, I guess, to brand awareness, someone who has a larger and well-known brand? Is that an advantage for someone with a direct mail campaign?
Good question, Michael. There really is a role for the word brand in direct marketing, and it's a little bit distinct from the brand equity or how we talk about brands in the general advertising world. For me, the value and the power of the idea of brand in direct marketing is whether or not a prospect has heard of your company and has a favorable impression of your company, whether or not they've done business with you before. So if you have a significant brand, and some of the ones I've worked on and do work on right now include Prevention, Reader's Digest, and Better Homes and Gardens, these are really, really beloved, warm, fuzzy American brands that people have a sense of. They've seen them in the supermarket checkouts for years. These brands, as publishing brands, are very, very visible, and even as for-profit companies have a lot of trust associated with them. So those names are what I call door openers. Those companies all market books in addition to the magazines that they sell and other products and services. And so when an advertisement or a mail piece or even online, a landing page or a website, when those things come to the attention of a prospect, there's immediately a good sense of trust that's in place already because they're familiar with the name of the company, and there's a fair amount of trust that already pre-exists just because of the reputation of that company in the marketplace. The real foundation piece of a transaction or making promises to anybody about the value or the benefit of your content is a foundation of trust. And trust is very easily generated in relationships where people are familiar with your company and feel good about it. So those kinds of names and big brands are door openers. They show up in a household, either in mail or online, and there's some immediate trust associated with that company, and it just smooths out the path towards completing a transaction.
You're listening to an exclusive interview found on Michael Senoff's hardtofindseminars.com. What do you mean by door openers?
To what I've said, a door opener would be that familiar friend, the trusted company, the trusted name, where people are willing to read their ad or consider their sales proposition, where in a non-branded case, even those same set of benefits or promises even if they're desired by that person, they'd be far less likely to read an ad if it didn't come from a friendly, familiar face, if you will. So when a piece of mail from Reader's Digest shows up, that's what I call a door opener, because it's an entree, it's a pass, it's a ticket to get that person's attention.
It gets the letter open.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some great ways that you've seen to get maybe a non-branded company to get that letter open?
It's important, even for well-known brands or well-known doctors or financial advisors or information marketers or, I'm sure there's a range of people and a range of businesses that are listening to us. But even for known names and known companies, if you really look at a range of advertising, once again, in all different channels, you'll see companies make the effort in the beginning of a sales letter or in the beginning of a marketing message to reaffirm who they are, to reaffirm their leadership position in their marketplace, to remind you that they've been trusted by Americans for 97 years or whatever they're saying. So it's never not a good thing to do. It's always a good thing to reaffirm that, no matter how well known you are. If you're not well known, or for many companies, and many, by the way, this is not a judgment, lots of huge, successful marketing companies that have literally no recognition in the marketplace or at the household level. And for those companies, the important things are, number one, to look good, that the advertising messages in direct mail or in any other channel look and really give people a sense that this company is trustworthy. So if you're mailing and you're in just a simple, 1 or 2 color format and, the kind of thing that you'd get from just sort of a local company down the block trying to generate lawn cutting business, that's not the look for a major national company. So you want to look as good as some of those bigger companies look. And these days, with production methodology being what it is, it's not always as costly as you think to look that good. But you also want to make promises. You want to have a real airtight, solid guarantee that people can trust. You want to have client testimonials or customer testimonials if it's appropriate to your product. You want to have a customer experience and customer service capability that's just seamless and that takes great care of people. I think no matter how many customers you have, whether it's, a few dozen or thousands, you want to give every single person a fantastic experience such that next time you walk out of your house, you'd be willing to meet those people and have them know it was you that they did business with and to feel great about it. So I think looking good and customer care, customer experience, guarantees, testimonials, and when you think of it, these are the kinds of things that make it easier for prospects to consider doing business with you, are the very same things that put trust and credibility into the relationship.
These are good things once the letter gets open. How about some tips on, you're mailing millions and millions of pieces, and obviously if we can get that letter open more often than not thrown away, what are some good things you've learned that would help our listeners make sure when they're doing direct mail to get that thing opened? For example, mail first class versus third class. Is there an advantage to mailing first class?
Well, mailing first class with either, what we call a meter printed postage for first class, or if it's a smaller number of mail pieces, just a physical stamp, that will usually increase open rates. I think that's a good one.
By how much? Any idea?
Michael, I don't know what the percentages are, and of course, in many cases, once you're into thousands, a physical stamp is probably impractical for most, because if you test that and you're successful with it, it's not a scalable application to have people sitting in a room putting stamps on tens of thousands of pieces of mail. You always want to test and validate success with things that are scalable, that's for sure. And the other thing is that first-class postage probably only makes sense for fairly costly products or services in relatively small markets. If you're a business-to-business marketer and you are marketing to a business segment that just has a few hundred or a few thousand people nationwide, then first-class postage might be significant because in a business it gets priority and it's associated with a high-value, high-margin product or service. And so in that case, it probably makes the most sense. At the consumer consumer level, it's probably not something I'd suggest.
How about mail delivery? Is the United States Post Office doing a better job of getting our mail delivered now than they were 20 years ago, or have you seen variances over the years?
I'm not a postage or deliverability expert, but having been in the direct mail channel for now 25 years, I think their efficiencies are probably higher. I think their speed is probably greater. I don't know that actual delivery rates have improved. Even with lists that have been recently updated, and by recent I would say, within weeks or a month or two of the dropping of the mail, there will always be 4 or 5% of the mail pieces that are just not deliverable for one reason or another. That could be a data error having nothing to do with the post office, and then there's just people that no matter how fresh the list is have moved or passed away, things like that. But there's not been much of a conversation about deliverability so much as the post office gaining efficiency through technology.
Okay, I was just curious. Let's talk about how a marketer could establish credibility. And you talk about own your position or take a position, I guess, in your marketing message. What does that mean?
Well, as an example, a friend of mine and someone that I know you know, Jay Abraham, talks about something called the strategy of preeminence, which really encourages good companies and good professionals to take a position. And so an example of a position, could be America's foremost tax advisor or America's most trusted doctor. I mean, these kinds of things. So owning your position is if you're a well-known doctor, financial advisor, web marketer who's written books, who's well-known both from like the Barnes & Noble stacks in retail stores or Amazon, etc. You've been on television. If you legitimately are well-known, once again, this is not a judgment, it's just something to acknowledge. If you as a brand or as a personality or as an advisor are well-known, then you want to use that obviously as that door opener we were talking about, or really as that way to help people trust you and to establish credibility and to have trust and credibility in the foundation of the marketing message discussed and established early in the copy, that your promises and the things that you claim and promise to customers are heard or read on this foundation of trust and credibility, and so they have weight, they hold water. Take a position means, once again, if you're not a household name, if you're not well known even in your industry, but you do have extraordinary value to offer in your product or service, talk about how many years you've done it. Talk about how you're the best known in the state or the region, or however way you can categorize your positive notoriety or your reputation or your years of service or your integrity or whatever that is. Come up with a tagline or some language to help people understand the commitment that you've had and how long you've been doing what you've been doing. So when you look at a product or service from that perspective, there's almost always a way to take a position in the marketplace by describing yourself or your business in those terms.
Okay, great. So I've got to ask you, you mentioned you knew Eugene Schwartz. You probably know Marty Edelson. Who put Boardroom on the map? Was it Eugene Schwartz's copy or was it Mel Martin's copy? Maybe both of them, but one went first. Do you know the story about that? I think Mel Martin was a copywriter and Schwartz did copy for him. What's the true story, do you know?
Well, I wasn't there to observe it. The founding of Boardrooms and the stories that you're referring to are actually even before my time. But I've heard the story recounted and told many times, and I can only really say what Marty has said, which is that he was sitting with Gene Schwartz, and Gene heard some of the things that Marty was saying, and sometimes the best copy comes out of the passionate entrepreneur that, has the vision for the business. And Gene heard some of the things that Marty was saying and took notes, and then went and wrote a sales letter for what at that time was the flagship publication of Boardroom Inc., which was a small business advisory newsletter called Boardroom Reports. And Boardroom Reports, as do the Boardroom newsletters today, all of which have the Bottom Line brand. They're all consumer titles now. But Boardroom Reports would digest and distill great nuggets and great articles from a range of other business literature, magazines, and newsletters and put it all together in this nice digest format so that people could get the best of 40 or 50 publications without reading them all. But Gene was the one who, I think, wrote the first sales letter for Boardroom Reports, and that's the way Marty tells it. Mel Martin wrote for them for years, but I don't know when he came on the scene with them, but as I understand it was after Gene did.
Over your years, you've seen the popularity of newsletters being sold via direct mail. Has that gone down over the years with the cost of postage? Can you make physical newsletters a success in direct mail today?
There are still a pretty good number of newsletters in the marketplace, and the ones I'm talking about are for consumers. And they're virtually all about one of two things, either health or personal finance. Newsletters for consumers started in the investment and personal finance area, where a newsletter really was about news. It was timely information about market picks and stock recommendations and things that actually were time sensitive. And then some of those same publishers brought health editorial into a newsletter format, and of course health editorial and content had been offered in magazines virtually for the entire history of magazines, back into the 40s and 50s. But, health newsletters really did very, very well and continue to do well to this day. Most of the ones that have been around in the last 20 years are still around today. It's a very short list of health newsletters that have discontinued publishing, and I think the same could be said on the investment side of the business as well. Most of the investment newsletters are published by specific advisors or personalities or gurus, as we call them, with market picks, stock recommendations, and so forth. On the health side of the business, there are a few ways in which these publications are positioned. Number one, as people have seen with individual doctors, most of whom are fairly progressive in philosophy and sort of their health and healing methods. So those are individual doctors. Then there are health newsletters positioned with institutions like Harvard Medical School and Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic and so forth. And these are not positioned with doctors. They're faceless, as I call them, but people trust them because they come from these trusted, very highly respected hospitals and colleges. And then there are consumer advocates like Consumer Reports, and then there are some ailment-specific, condition-specific newsletters and some other assorted newsletters that are positioned in different ways. But the print newsletter business is still quite robust. In fairness, a lot of the circulation numbers, a lot of the subscriber counts are down from what they were years ago, as much as 20, 30, 40% in some cases. But the print newsletter business is still a very important business.
Why are those numbers down? Is it because of the internet or a combination of expense in mailing and promoting? Why are these numbers down?
Well, in many cases it's because similar information, comparable information is available on the internet for free. In other cases, it's not really a matter of channel migration on the part of the subscribers, but just other kinds of pressures that have been to specific companies that play in the space. But from a consumer perspective, the biggest trend has been that there's just a proliferation of information about health from very good, reputable, credible sources that is available for free.
Okay. I want to just name 3 types of mailings, and just if you can comment on anything about each one of these. 1, lumpy mail or dimensional mail. 2, a tear sheet mailing. I know they've been pretty popular in the past. I don't know if you see anyone successfully using tear sheet mailers. And 3, the magalog. And explain what each one of them is to the listener and what advantage maybe each one has.
Well, why don't we go in reverse order?
All right, the magalog, is that still hot today?
The magalog is a very, very hot, powerful format that's been around at this point, I'm going to say 15 to 20 years.
All right, explain what it is.
A magalog is a full-color format with which when you go to your mailbox and take the mail out of your box, it would look just like a catalog or a magazine, thus the term magalog. And it is generally used to sell either books, newsletters, or products like health supplements or things like that. It's a very powerful format of mail in that it can be mailed to lists of people that have come from catalogs, because people that buy from catalogs find it to be a friendly, familiar format because it looks and feels just like a catalog does. It also can be very effectively mailed to lists of people who have bought from television infomercials because it's colorful and vibrant and has a lot of energy and has calls to action on every page. And in a sense, it's like putting an infomercial on 24 pages of full-color paper. So magalogs are a very, very effective format for mailing to a wide range of list sources. And, as we talked about non-branded companies earlier in our talk, a 4-color, full-color maglog enables a company to look trustworthy and big and significant and really to look like other competitors that might be far bigger, but it sort of equalizes the playing field because it lets you look really good.
Who started that whole concept? Do you know the history on it?
Well, the investment newsletter business was the category in which maglogs were born. And as we talked about a few minutes ago, some of those same investment publishers that started up health newsletter and health book businesses brought the maglog into very effective use in their health businesses as well. And then ultimately, tremendous companies like Rodale, which publishes prevention and men's health, and Boardroom, and what was then Phillips Publishing, became the major users of the maglog format, and who over many years developed and improved upon its performance with specific devices and sort of techniques inside the maglog.
The second format was a tear sheet mailing.
That's the one where you open a white envelope and there's what looks like a little newspaper article in there and somebody's handwritten on there, "Hey, Michael, have a look at this."
Yeah, that's correct.
I don't have a lot of experience with those myself. I haven't worked with any clients that have used them. My concern with that is that it's really represented to be something that it's not. It's not truly your buddy sending you an article from a newspaper. It's a company wanting to look that way. And so for me, there's some inauthenticity there that is not how I'd want to begin my relationship with a new customer. And I don't think it represents a company very well because there's a little bit of a trick there that the users of that format really aren't sort of owning up to.
Right, I agree.
That's a format that, while not illegal, is just one of those things that there's a little bit of trickery there that I just don't think is the way to go.
Okay. How about using dimensional mail or, lumpy mail that has something in it that supposedly increases the open rate because of the dimension?
In the consumer business, I'm sure there are a few examples, but in past years, different fundraising organizations or even marketers of pens have put a sample pen in the envelope or some address labels that might be either visible through a window or actually have some physical dimension to them. I haven't seen very much of that. I think going back to our talk about first-class mail, this is the kind of thing that, depending how big it is, if it's a box, obviously that's really going to get attention when it shows up and probably best suited in terms of its scalability into relatively small numbers, best suited for business-to-business, selling either products or advisory services that are fairly substantially priced. But the mail regulations from the post office for circulating those kinds of things, I think, have just become more and more challenging, and you don't see companies in the consumer space really doing that much anymore.
For more exclusive interviews on business, marketing, advertising, and copywriting, go to Michael Senoff's hardtofindseminars.com. Okay. When you mentioned about the magalogs, how it appeals to television infomercial buyers and catalog buyers, it allowed you to increase your market space because that appeal was there. It gave you more of a universe for the mailing. And that kind of comes into play with this next topic. How do you find customers way beyond your immediate category for anyone marketing something?
It's possible. Some of the time it's not always possible. So as an example, if somebody is selling a special report about strategies for fly fishing or how to make a great country quilt, those are special interest hobbies and special interest activities. For the most part, that advertising will not get anybody to start doing those things that wasn't previously doing them. We can't be too creative in terms of sending mail to woodworkers or pilots. People either work with wood or they don't, or they fly a plane or they don't. But the area where you can get creative and do a little bit of interesting thinking is in some areas that people many times think are special interest subjects that really are much more universal than sometimes people think. People impose limits on themselves and their own businesses.
Give me an example.
Well, two good examples would be cooking and gardening. Two fantastic examples would be health, personal finance. I call health and personal finance really these universal subject matters that sometimes people think are special interest subjects that really have universal appeal because everybody's dealing with health or money in one way or another. If you're in your 30s or 40s, you're mostly in a prevention mode with respect to your health, hopefully living a lifestyle that will help you avoid serious disease later in life. And from a financial perspective, hopefully you're saving the best you can. There are obviously very large markets of people in their 60s and 70s who are facing illness or who are facing, their savings is not as strong or they don't have as much money saved as they'd like to. And so there are products out there for those people. So when we're talking about what I'm calling the great examples like health or money, these universal subjects, that's where you can look at the kind of product you're selling, its price point, the style and tone of the copy that you're using to sell it, and your mail piece format, and say, okay, if issues around health are of greatest interest to people in their 60s, let's say, and health is really a universal concern for people in their 60s, either on the prevention side or on the remedy side, where can we find people in their 60s that are congregating, that are making purchases such that there are good, solid lists of those people, and that they're spending some money, and that we see they have reverence for a brand, and that they're responsive to direct marketing copy, and can we actually get those people to migrate or to cross categories from the place where we have found them over to buying our health book, let's say. And so it turns out that when you look at the marketplace from that perspective, just the one variable you're removing is that there's a pre-existing interest in health. You don't know that, but you know their age, you know their socioeconomics, you know they like to buy through direct marketing. And so as it turns out, there are people that fit that bill quite perfectly in other categories like gardening, like veterans appeals, fundraising, like buying clothing through catalogs, buying financial information or money-saving information from other publications. There's quite a range of categories of people that migrate to health information, even if the place where we found them had nothing to do with health.
Okay, so you're looking at different lists, and this is a way to expand your market by going after those names.
Right. You're finding people in categories, and you're sort of assessing what these people are about, how old they are, what their sensibilities are, what their buying habits are, and you know enough about them that you can make a pretty good bet that they'll be willing to buy your product. And, of course, the beauty of the direct marketing method is that you can test at a relatively small expenditure and financial risk and then roll out in more substantial numbers once that particular list performance is validated. And you can take that same kind of creative approach with entry-level money-making information, and that could be as entry-level as couponing. Just at the household level, budgeting and money saving and those kinds of things are also what I call these universal topics. Household hints would be another one. And, companies like Boardroom and Reader's Digest and Rodale and Better Homes and Gardens have had book after book after book that have presented this kind of material and done very, very well and have expanded their market with this kind of thinking. Now, when we say expand their market, the question comes up, well, how much does the market expand? Well, for, say, health information in either a book or a newsletter or a magazine format, going to some peripheral markets outside of the immediate health market could double or triple the size of your campaign. So these are not small gains that we're talking about. These are very, very significant increases in building your prospect market, like by a factor of 2 or 3. I mean, even finding a 20 or 30% gain of prospects that otherwise would have been left on the table would be significant. But to double or triple your marketplace is obviously quite a dramatic achievement.
Okay, that's great. Let's say we've got a neophyte listening, and maybe a lot of what they're hearing is really way over their head, and there are people out there who really don't even have a clue about what information is available out there on mailing lists. You've been in the industry so long, you know how much data is compiled on people through their buying habits and such, but could you explain to the neophyte basically simply what you do and how you can find a name or a market, just the vast amount of data out there for, say, maybe someone who's in business who never had a clue or never even thought about using direct mail to increase their business?
Well, in the list brokerage function and the media brokerage function, what I do is work directly with clients, having some of the very same kinds of conversations that you and I have been having, touching on these same kinds of topics, understanding the marketplace, understanding the needs of the marketplace, understanding how the product fits into that picture, coaching and directing their copywriters and creative teams, coming up with the right, accurate, and powerful messaging to talk to these markets, and then in the list brokerage function, selecting the right lists for a launch or a test campaign, segmenting those lists properly, whether it's for transactions in the last 3 months or whether we need men or women for a gender-focused product, whatever the specific segment of the list might be, and then executing all the list transactions for the campaign. There are campaigns that might have 3 or 4 lists, and there are campaigns that might have 100 lists. So there's a one-stop shopping sort of benefit to working with me or the kind of firm that I work for, but much more importantly than the efficiency of it is to work with a list broker who understands your marketplace and who can guide you without any self-orientation, without any aspirations for volume that might sway his or her decisions in ways that are not in your best interest. What we call the list universe, or the available lists, number in the tens of thousands. So the first thing that the list broker will do, besides helping you select and segment the ultimate list for your campaign, is to understand the thousands that you need to stay away from. I often tell people that are new to the direct mail channel that the purpose of the direct mail launch or the first mailing that you do is really a referendum on the viability of your product in the mail channel and the selling copy that's been written and prepared to sell the product. The lists should really not be in question. There will be a question of whether they ultimately will work or not. But after the launch, I don't sit with clients and we don't say, gee, maybe we picked the wrong list. Because we're working with lists in a launch situation that really will give us an accurate sort of litmus test or an accurate green light or red light as to the viability of the product as a direct mail sold product. We use lists that we've known to work for years and years and years, from which the results will be really trustworthy, accurate results, just like a litmus test.
So that sounds like one of the real key value points in working with you is throughout your history, you know the list and the ones that work, where other brokers or other so-called experts in the field may not have that experience and know.
I appreciate that, and I think that's a fair point. The interesting thing about when we talk about these home run products or these massive home runs, there have been books that I've been involved with that have mailed as many as 10 or 15 or in a few cases in excess of 20 million names in a single campaign. But those campaigns were built out from very small, and by small I mean under 100,000 test campaigns where we methodically and surgically sort of built our foundation of results so that when we got into the millions, we knew with really good confidence that that mailing would turn out exactly how we envisioned that it would. When we talk about these books that can be promoted to 15 or 20 million people, like Reader's Digest had a book a few years ago, Extraordinary Uses for Ordinary Things, which is, how to get a stain out with mustard or, whatever. When you think about these books or similar products that are all things to all people, the very interesting question becomes, well, who do you mail that to? If something is that universal and has that broad an appeal, you really do need somebody to help you navigate the waters of direct mail lists to figure out who to mail to, because even the all things to all people products, these home run monster products, there's a limit to the list that can be mailed. The thousands that are available, even though that book might be able to mail 10 or 15 or 20 million pieces, it still is critical to know where those names are coming from. And so sometimes the biggest opportunities hold the biggest challenges. You're not in a niche market. You're in a broad-based, very broad sort of value proposition. That's when it's probably hardest to nail down your target, not easiest.
I bought that book, actually. Was that a big monster?
Yeah, it was.
A monster like that. How long does a campaign like that last? Do they keep mailing and mailing until it's not profitable anymore? Does it go a number of years or what?
In what we call the one-shot book business, meaning the offer is a book, it's not a continuity series, it's not a club, there's no ongoing obligation to do anything, it's just a single purchase of the book. That's the one-shot book business. Those types of offers, even the most successful ones in the last 20-plus years, have had a effective marketing lifespan of maybe 2 to 2.5 years at the upside.
That's it.
That's really it. The Wall Street Journal, of course, has been around forever, and they're using a direct mail piece that was written literally like 30 years ago. So there are publications and marketing pieces associated with those products that have incredible longevity. But the dynamics of the marketplace for one-shot books are such that anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, even the massive home runs sort of flame out after just a few years.
Have you ever seen maybe one-shot home runs from 10 or 15 years ago been revived and been successful? Have you ever seen people try and do that?
Occasionally it's tried, and it's a very, very interesting exercise. I've seen it tried a couple times, and it really seems like there's sort of this magical window opportunity that when a book has its time, it has its time. Because you try to bring back a home run book 4 or 5 years later when all the people in the list marketplace have no memory for the fact that they may have seen that mail, and there's all new people on lists doing business in the marketplace, and you try to recreate that home run several years later. I've never seen it work. They have their moment in the sun, and once it's done, it's usually done. Just how it works.
You've got a lot of people building successful internet businesses, and there's a lot of people who have successful direct mail businesses. Do you have anything to say about crossing over from internet to direct mail? I've heard that if you're successful online, you could be 3, 4, 5 times as successful in the mail because the mail is maybe more responsive, and then vice versa. If you're successful in direct mail, what have you seen crossing over to internet? Can that success be matched? Or just what do you have to say? From internet to direct mail, from direct mail to internet? Any feedback?
Yeah. Well, I'm really channel agnostic, meaning, I don't have a preference or an agenda for what media, what channels people are in, because I'm consulting with some pure web companies and certainly helping other companies in direct mail and working with other companies to make both channels work. A lot of the behavioral components of positioning, of how people read and react to copy, how they deal with price points and offers, these things are not channel specific. Human nature and consumer behavior generate and reveal themselves in very, very predictable ways in all channels of marketing. So that's number one. These things are not channel specific, which I think is very, very good news. The thing about moving from online to offline, particularly for, entrepreneurs in their 30s and 40s who really virtually grew up, dyed-in-the-wool online marketers, there's really a different culture and a different mindset and even a different accounting for the offline space, in terms of time frames. People that have kind of come up in their business careers online are accustomed to that sort of speed and getting test results in, minutes or hours and those kinds of things. Sometimes the expense of physical mail, the logistics involved in production and printing and mailing, and just the time frames involved in getting results become a little bit of a shock as compared to the speed of online testing and rolling out, so from validating all kinds of variables. But just in terms of pure ability to succeed, I don't think everything that can be sold online can be sold in direct mail as a solo product, meaning that's the only product being sold in that ad or in that mail piece. But a great many can be. I'm certainly an advocate for companies that have enough people inside their organization to execute these programs that business not be left on the table. I think going from offline to online, there's probably some similar considerations and maybe some different ones. It's really the converse. It's going from these long, expensive, protracted time frames and production processes to relatively quick learnings and quick turnaround on the internet. There are things that are priced and positioned offline where offers and payment methods online need to be changed. There's very little happening online that would be what we would call soft offer billing, or what enables a consumer to say, bill me later. So companies that do that in direct mail, which there's a lot of them selling books, newsletters, and magazines in a bill me later environment, those kinds of transactions, when those companies go to the web, need to be converted to credit card, pay with order transactions. And so a lot of times the creative has to be rewritten. Certainly the sales and order language and offers need to be articulated differently. So when you go from one channel to the other, there are definitely considerations, but ultimately I think the answer is it depends. But there's no question that there are people listening to this now that are leaving business on the table because they're not doing one channel or the other.
Okay. I think I did ask, I don't know if you touched on it, is to explain to the newbie the sheer volume of information. To me, it's amazing that you can get a name in a targeted list for just about anything you can think of that's out there. Was that something that you were going to hit on?
No, but I think that's a nice benefit of the direct mail channel, is that there are targeted lists in virtually every category imaginable, not only in the consumer markets, but in the business-to-business markets, even where there may not be very large transaction lists, for example, maybe people who are coin collectors. There's not a lot of magazine and product buyer lists out there associated with coin collecting, just as a kind of a off-the-top-of-my-head example. But there are survey lists of people who are what we call self-reported, who have filled out surveys and said, I'm interested in coin collecting or foreign travel or wine or gardening or whatever. And those kinds of responder and questionnaire lists gather, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of names in what would otherwise be very limited niche markets. And so there's a nice targeting opportunity offline that in many cases is not available online, or the competition for keywords or, the kinds of bidding that happens for advantageous search positions cuts a lot of companies out of sort of a favorable position to come to people's attention. And in the offline world, that competition just isn't there. So that's a real benefit of working in direct mail, is there isn't that sort of clamoring for those positions.
As a list broker in your career, I know your job is to help companies market their product, and the list broker works on a commission. But is part of a list broker's job to go out to companies who maybe never even considered putting their list out on the list rental market, like with SRDS? You say there's tens of thousands of direct mail lists out there, but I'm sure there's at least that many out there that are not on the market or never considered being on the market. Whose job is it to get these lists onto the market? Is that a broker's job or more like the SRDS?
SRDS isn't chasing those people down. SRDS is just a venue, is just a reference directory to the lists that are available. Sometimes marketers in a niche market will have somebody on staff just to call some of the smaller companies that, the phrase is, they'll have their list like on index cards in a shoebox. I'm sure there's still some of that around, but hopefully not as much as there used to be. But most list brokerage companies, and certainly this one, we're sort of way past the point where we can chase down some of those smaller early stage companies with their relatively small lists. Obviously, if there's a big player out there, a couple of examples would be like Netflix or AARP. Those are two good examples, one of a relatively new company and one of a fairly old line organization whose membership lists are not on the market. Any list brokerage firm would be happy to be associated with either of those brands in representing those lists. But going after some of the smaller early stage niche companies who just have not put their lists out, there's really nobody chasing them other than maybe some specific grassroots efforts on the part of their competitors or people that would like to exchange with them.
Are there some large companies like a Netflix who just choose not to go onto the list market?
Oh, without a doubt. It's a good example and a good question. Most of the pure web plays that are out there, whether that's eBay or Amazon or just about anybody you could name, the pure web plays, as a pretty good rule, I can't really think of one that have either their email list or their postal list on the list rental market. They're categorically absent from the list rental market. There are some more traditional catalogers, like catalog brands that have been known in direct mail for decades, that do have available on their list the ability to segment people who bought on the web. But the pure web companies categorically are absent from the list rental marketplace.
Okay. What should early stage companies and startups learn from big mature companies?
This probably becomes a little bit of a repeat, or certainly a connection to what we talked about early in terms of trust and credibility. Early stage companies should know how to really kind of button themselves up for the market, if you will. And I don't mean to deceive the market, but just to look trustworthy, to use four-color production printing, offline or online, to use good resources to present a great website or a great landing page, to have testimonials, to have guarantees, to commit to phenomenal customer experience. Once again, these days it's easier than ever before to come out into the marketplace and not have the size of your organization be transparent to the marketplace just because you look like you're a small two-person shop. It's just not necessary anymore. So committing to customer service and great customer experience and having satisfaction guarantees, money-back guarantees, and so forth will really help an early-stage company get some nice velocity in the marketplace.
Okay. What would you tell someone, let's say they have an online product and they have a sales letter that's working online and they've got a digital product that has some huge margins and they'd like to do a test in direct mail, but they've never done it before, and let's say they have a budget of $5,000 to test something like that. Is that enough to get a good statistical answer whether the product and the letter and the promotion could work, $5,000, or do you think you need more?
I don't think 5,000 is enough. And this really speaks to doing a test that is worthwhile, that does have you sort of looking the look to get people's trust and to get people to buy and participate with you. Number one, to get a decent test, you'd want to test at least 5 lists, so 25,000 names in total. So your list cost is going to be roughly half the 5,000 already, and that's before you've accounted for a good, strong copywriter and then just the production and printing and postage.
What does it take for someone who wants to test a product that they believe is viable online? How much could one expect to invest? How long would it take, supposing they already have the letter written?
If you've got the copy and the creative in place, let's assume the lists are about $3,000 for a good, solid comparative test of 25,000 names, which would get you 5 separate segments from 5 separate lists. So $25,000 and figuring $300 to $400 per thousand in the mail with lists, production, and postage. So that's the math.
Okay, $300 to $400 per thousand?
Right. It's about $10,000. It's about double of the number you proposed.
Okay, so $10,000 we could probably do a test and see if the thing has legs, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let's say you're going to be the list broker and you're going to look for these 5 lists. What are you going to take into consideration other than the market of the list? How big or what size universe are these lists going to have? Meaning if we see something that's working in one of the lists, we have lots and lots of names to step it up a little bit?
Exactly. 3 things. We want clients and marketers to invest in things because really the test is an investment. We want them to invest in things that can have an upside. So really the 3 critical pieces of the suitability of a list for this important strategic role in a launch is that we know that it's been used in the past repeatedly and that if the offer is good, the list will work. That it's large enough to roll out into so that it's worth the investment. There's an upside to it. So an upside could mean that if we test 5,000, that there's at least 20 or 30 or 40,000 left in the segment that we've tested. In some cases, there may be hundreds of thousands remaining in the segment that we tested, but we wouldn't get to mail those several 100,000 until maybe 2 or 3 mailings later, really sort of building up to that volume. The other consideration is that a list in a launch should be a nice, reliable predictor of the productivity or the performance of other similar lists within its category. So we want to pick the fundraising list that's the best litmus test and predictive tool for the fundraising category. Same with catalogs, same with books, newsletters, magazines, infomercial transactions, catalog transactions. So it really becomes this process that many people just sort of guess has a high degree of uncertainty involved with it. And it actually is a very sort of surgically tight process that has a high rate of predictability and a high rate of success. Once we come out of the launch and we've learned if we have the ability to move forward with that creative, it's almost like putting the market on puppet strings. And not in a manipulative way, but just in terms of a way that brings certainty to what you're doing.
I mean, I'm sure you've had clients who want to test something at the very beginning, and let's say they invest $10,000 and you're testing to 5 different lists, and you see some real success in that initial test. You could look at that test and pretty much with not total certainty, but you have a gut feeling that this is going to be a winner based on those results.
Well, exactly. And being in the marketplace for 25 years, so it's kind of like radiologists reading an X-ray. To some people, it looks like a bunch of fuzzy, foggy nothing, and the radiologist can give you an hour-long talk about it. Reading launch results in the direct mail channel, and I'm sure there are the analogous sort of assessments online and for television and so forth. In the direct mail channel, reading launch results should be a very clear green light or red light, either proceed or stop. But you want those first-time direct mail launch results to really give you a great, believable read on whether to proceed or whether not to proceed. And if the answer is the direct mail channel is not appropriate, then it was a worthwhile investment because it helped you rule out that channel and it prevented you from throwing more money at it. And so you really need a partner who's willing to make that call and tell you to either shamelessly proceed, take no prisoners, and go for it, or stop right here because these results, for the following reasons, are saying to stop.
Right. How long does it take from the time one would say, I want to do this, to getting everything in the mail and getting the results back? What's a realistic expectation that you would tell a client?
Probably from green light where someone says, hey, I'd like to try this. The list side is just a matter of a few weeks, but to get the printing and production aspects lined up properly is probably what takes the longest in terms of the logistics of the project. That can take 60 days or so to line up the right suppliers and to get it done, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So 60 to 90 days from a go decision to being in the mail.
Okay, and what part will you play if you chose to take one on as a client? What can one expect from you as you being in their corner on this whole promotion?
Apart from obviously evaluating the available lists and giving guidance on that segmentation and setting up the plan and the actual participating list, I work with clients on some of these finer points of positioning and copy. Many times I'm coaching or directing either their in-house creative team or their outside freelancers, depending on which is the case. So I have a more strategic, broader advisory role in most cases in my client work than just the list plan itself. So that's how that usually goes.
Let's say one needed help with their copy. You could refer over to someone who could handle that. And what about printing? Do you take any part in that? Let's say a client comes to you. He doesn't know anything about the printing or the envelopes, any of that stuff. Are you involved in any of that with your client?
The printing and production is not an area that I have focused on. I mean, as a firm, we don't contract those services at all. Through working with the great marketers and the admired companies that I work with, I can always get good references for people. But off the top of my head, printing and production is not a world that I know on the production side. But offering guidance around copy and graphics and the presentation of the selling message is where I do a tremendous amount of work, some of it on paid retainer just to offer that kind of opinions and guidance. And most of the major copywriters are acquaintances and in many cases friends of mine. So, for marketers that want to sort of get on the waiting list for some of the top writers in the country, most of them are sort of good colleagues of mine.
Okay. There's some listeners listening to this interview, and they like what they hear, and they've got products that maybe have some legs, and they want to think about expanding into direct mail. What's an ideal client for you? Who should call? Who shouldn't call?
I think people may have a sense of it already from what we've discussed. Once again, these themes and these kinds of conversations play a pretty big role in client work. It's important that clients be serious about what they're doing. And this is not just to work with me. This is hopefully what everybody would take on just to be a great company. But it's important that people have great products and be passionate about what they're doing and be committed to great customer experience. If they're either in direct mail and wanting to talk about, improving the success rates and just making their current work in direct mail smarter, or if you're one of the people I spoke about before, dyed-in-the-wool born online and thinking that possibly you're leaving something on the table and growing your business, and direct mail offline could be one place to begin getting some of that sort of foregone revenue off the table and into action. We can talk about direct mail. We can talk about the size of the list universe for you, and potentially I can advise you on getting that up and running and how best to position and language the sales letter and so forth. So either list planning or general business growth consulting. And in fact, as I said, some of my clients don't do direct mail at all, and they never should, and I tell them not to. So I work with some pure web plays on all these same themes as well.
What's the best way for anyone who wants to contact you?
The firm that I'm at is Specialist Marketing Services in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, and the phone here is 201-865-5800.
Okay, and so they can call you, and then you'll set up a time, and you'll talk about, I guess, their needs, and just go from there.
Sure. I've been very fortunate to have, done a good amount of speaking, and I'm fairly visible on Twitter and places like that. There's certainly more folks calling. I wish I could help everybody. I know we people in this business tend to be so purpose-driven, and we want to help. I wish I could help everybody, but I can't. But, I certainly invite anybody to call, and if I personally can't help you, I promise you a referral to somebody that you can trust to help you.
Why don't you give out your website, because I've seen those special reports on your website, and those are an incredible education just on their own, on direct mail and lists and all that. There's some great free reports at your website. How could someone get those?
It's Specialist. It's a plural word ending in S, and the letter M as in marketing, the letter S as in services.com. SpecialistMS.com.
Okay, great. What could you tell me about the market of the stuff I do? You know, my interviews on direct marketing, money making, copywriting, that type of market. I guess the buyer of maybe Nightingale Conant, motivational type stuff. What's that market like? Is it a rabid market or is it a tough market to sell to?
I've worked with Nightingale Conant for, over 15 years. I work with learning strategies. I work with lots of individual advisors and coaches in just building their businesses, and I work with some of the major publishers in the space and, helping guys like Jay Abraham try to build their businesses, and of course he's massively successful. So it's an interesting space that I'm very familiar with, and in fact the direct mail universe for it is relatively limited. A lot of the information marketing and web marketing and those kinds of activities happen in the marketplace at this sort of crossroads of entrepreneurialism that's legitimate and where people are really putting together business plans and building good, solid businesses. So it's the crossroads of that entrepreneurialism and sort of an opportunism where people want to get rich quick and are just looking for a way to make quick money and not really bringing kind of a well-measured plan and longer-term vision to what they're doing. So it's a difficult list marketplace to navigate. It's not very big.
When you say big, are there 50 million people in the universe?
Well, there's always more in the actual universe, meaning in the country, than there are on, say, the radar screen where they've actually done a transaction and they appear on a direct mail list. By small in this marketplace, I would say an annualized number for that universe might be a few 100,000 total prospects that are on legitimate lists that are a good match for what you're doing. But even that's a fairly sort of rosy, optimistic number. The direct mail is a tough space to make that kind of thing work. The best direct mail for those kinds of subjects is done in the same way you would do affiliate marketing. You'd get somebody to endorse you to their list, and instead of doing an email, do a direct mail letter, with other consultants or other advisors in the marketplace.
Okay. How effective are postcards, postcard marketing? Well, I know there's a price benefit for postcards, but generally, have you seen postcards work? I'm sure they work for something. What's your comment on postcard mailing, direct mail?
Postcards are a very, very difficult format to make work. The most successful examples of where postcards have worked in the marketplace years ago, they were used by magazines that were well-known household names where there wasn't a lot of copy required to help people understand what the magazine was about or the reasons they should trust it or could expect value from it. And then those same magazines moved into envelope formats and other what we call vouchers and so forth. But the trouble with postcards is they don't offer a lot of space to do the important things that the selling copy needs to do, which is to, once again, establish credibility, help people understand what the product is, how it works, and how it's relevant to what they want. There's very, very precious little space to make that happen, even in sort of an enlarged postcard format. Once again, in local communities for traffic building for services around the home or, a new dental office, those kinds of things where there's an affinity for someone who's just opened a business in your hometown, it's easier to make that work. But for a national campaign of any consequence, a postcard is very, very difficult to work with.
How about using a postcard to take offline to online, get them from offline to an online space? Have you seen that work?
At least for the moment, I'm an advocate for that, and I say for the moment because I have some tests out with clients right now that are either going to turn me into a fan of that approach or not. Because in that case, the postcard doesn't need to do the entire job. The job of the postcard is just to get you to the landing page. And so I think a postcard is sufficient space to get somebody to a landing page. When we look at creative all the way down to an individual word, and this is something that Gene Schwartz really talked about, the job of a word really is to move you to the next word. And if every single word in a promotion successfully moved you to the next word, you'd get to the end and you'd have an option to order, and hopefully you would, right? So at the microscopic level, that's the role of language in marketing. Each word gets you to the next word. Well, the job of the postcard as a whole bunch of words is to get you to the landing page, and I think that's quite possible.
All right. I think we're out of time. This has been great, Michael. This is the end of Part 1. Please continue to Part 2. For more interviews like this, go to hardtofindseminars.com.